The security guard's clipboard held 347 names, each one carefully vetted, alphabetically arranged, and cross-referenced with military records. The funeral of General Robert Harrison was a private ceremony, limited to family, close friends, and distinguished colleagues who had earned their place through decades of shared service. At the entrance to St. Matthew's Cathedral, 2 guards checked every guest against their list with military precision. No exceptions. No surprises. No room for error. But when the elderly man in the worn navy peacoat approached the cathedral steps, moving slowly but with unmistakable purpose, something about his bearing made the guards take notice. His shoulders carried the weight of age, but his spine remained straight. His hair was silver-white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes held the clarity of a man who had never forgotten where he belonged. When he reached the checkpoint, he stopped and waited patiently, hands clasped behind his back in a stance that spoke of decades of military discipline. What the guards couldn't see, what none of the arriving dignitaries understood, was that this man carried with him a story that would transform everyone's understanding of loyalty, sacrifice, and the bonds forged in war. A story that had been buried for 30 years, waiting for this moment to finally come to light. As he stepped inside, heads turned. The widow's eyes locked onto his face, and in an instant, the years peeled away. Her breath caught. Silent recognition passed between them, raw and undeniable. This was not a mistake. He wasn't an intruder. He was the missing piece of her husband's past, an echo from a battlefield, a name whispered in war letters, a promise once made in blood and brotherhood. And as tears welled in her eyes, she rose to her feet, not out of surprise, but in reverence. Some stories don't make the list. Some loyalties live beyond paper and protocol. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this deeply emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. If you believe stories about true friendship and unbreakable bonds deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey with us. St. Matthew's Cathedral stood like a fortress of faith against the gray November sky, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven while its stone walls held the weight of countless prayers and farewells. The funeral of General Robert Harrison had drawn military elite from across the nation, 4-star generals, Pentagon officials, Medal of Honor recipients, and politicians who understood the value of being seen honoring a genuine American hero. The cathedral's interior blazed with the colors of dress uniforms, ribbons and medals catching the light from stained glass windows that had witnessed decades of similar ceremonies. General Harrison had served his country for 42 years, commanding troops in Korea, Vietnam, and countless peacekeeping missions that never made headlines. His record was spotless, his leadership legendary, his retirement marked by honors that filled display cases and citation books. But beyond the public achievements, beyond the official recognition, lay a story that even his own family didn't fully understand. A story that had been searching for its conclusion for 3 decades. The security detail at the cathedral entrance had been carefully selected. Sergeant Major David Kim and Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, both with extensive experience in protocol and dignitary protection. Their job was simple: verify every guest against the approved list, maintain order, and ensure that this solemn occasion proceeded without disruption. They had been briefed on potential security concerns, given photographs of VIPs who might arrive without advance notice, and instructed to be courteous but firm with anyone whose name didn't appear on their carefully maintained roster. Inside the cathedral, Margaret Harrison sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. At 78, she remained elegant in her grief, wearing the same black dress she had worn to too many military funerals over the years. Her marriage to Robert had spanned 53 years, through deployments and relocations, through the demands of military life that tested every relationship it touched. She had been the perfect officer's wife, gracious, supportive, resilient in the face of uncertainty and separation. But even Margaret carried secrets. Stories about her husband's service that he had shared only with her, late at night when the weight of command and the memories of fallen soldiers made sleep impossible. Stories about a young sailor in Korea who had saved Robert's life during a brutal winter engagement near Seoul. A man whose courage under fire had earned Robert's eternal gratitude and whose friendship had shaped the course of both their lives in ways that went far beyond military service. The problem was that this sailor, William Torres, had disappeared from their lives 30 years ago, not through any falling out or deliberate separation, but through the simple chaos of military life. Transfers, deployments, discharge, and civilian careers had scattered the bonds of wartime friendship like leaves in a storm. Margaret and Robert had tried to find him over the years, especially as retirement approached and Robert began thinking more about the people who had shaped his journey. But William Torres seemed to have vanished into the vast population of American veterans, leaving behind only memories and a lingering sense of unfinished business. The morning service was scheduled to begin at 11 o'clock, and by 10:45, the cathedral was nearly full. Generals and colonels filled the pews with their families, creating a sea of military bearing mixed with civilian grief. The honor guard had taken their positions, the chaplain had reviewed his notes one final time, and the organist was preparing the opening hymn. Everything was proceeding according to plan. That's when William Torres approached the cathedral steps. At 76, William moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to navigate the world despite arthritis, diabetes, and the accumulated damage of 7 decades of hard living. His navy peacoat was old but clean, his shoes polished despite their age, his silver hair neatly combed beneath a veteran's cap that bore the insignia of the Korean War. He carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind that comes not from wealth or status but from a lifetime of doing the right thing even when no one was watching. Sergeant Major Kim noticed him first. Something about the man's approach triggered his professional instincts, not alarm, but attention. This wasn't someone wandering past the cathedral by accident. This was someone with a destination, someone who belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere wasn't immediately clear. William reached the checkpoint and stopped, waiting to be acknowledged. When Sergeant Major Kim approached with his clipboard, William offered a slight nod of recognition from one military man to another. "Good morning, sir," Kim said, his tone respectful but businesslike. "I'll need to check your name against our guest list." William Torres, the elderly man replied, his voice carrying the faint accent of his Puerto Rican childhood mixed with decades of American military service. Kim scanned the list once, his finger moving down the alphabetically arranged names. Torres. He checked under T, then double-checked under W for William. Nothing. He looked up at the old man, who waited patiently without showing any sign of surprise or frustration. "I'm sorry, sir," Kim said, genuinely apologetic. "I don't see your name on the approved list. This is a private ceremony, limited to family and specifically invited guests." William nodded, as if he had expected this response. "I understand, Sergeant Major. I wasn't sure I would be on any list. It's been a long time since Robert and I were in touch." Staff Sergeant Walsh joined the conversation, sensing the need for additional diplomacy. Something about this man's demeanor suggested he wasn't just another veteran hoping to pay respects to a fallen general. There was a familiarity in the way he spoke about the deceased, a personal connection that went beyond casual military acquaintance. "Sir, if you served with General Harrison, we might be able to contact the family and," Walsh began, but William raised a gentle hand to stop her. "No need to trouble anyone," he said quietly. "I should have called ahead. I saw the obituary in the paper yesterday and drove down from Philadelphia. Thought maybe I could pay my respects from the back of the church, but I understand about security. These are different times." The guards exchanged glances. This wasn't unusual. Veterans often showed up at military funerals hoping to honor fallen comrades, and turning them away was one of the more difficult aspects of their job. But something about William Torres made the decision feel wrong. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke about the general, the quiet acceptance of disappointment that suggested a man accustomed to being overlooked despite his service. "I'm really sorry, sir," Kim said, meaning it. "If you'd like to wait until after the service, you might be able to speak with the family then." William smiled, an expression that held more sadness than bitterness. "That's kind of you, but I don't want to intrude on their grief. Robert was a good man. I'm glad he had so many people who cared about him." He began to turn away, his movement slow but dignified. The guards watched him go, both feeling the weight of a decision that seemed necessary but cruel. They had followed protocol, protected the family's privacy, maintained the security of the ceremony. But they had also turned away an elderly veteran who had driven hours to honor a fallen comrade, and that knowledge sat heavily on their shoulders. Inside the cathedral, Margaret Harrison was making final adjustments to her composure before the service began. She had been strong throughout the week of preparation, handling arrangements with the same efficiency that had made her an exemplary military wife. But now, in these last moments before saying goodbye to the man who had been her anchor for more than half a century, the weight of loss was threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained control. She glanced toward the cathedral windows, seeking some distraction from her grief, some momentary focus on the world beyond this ceremony. The view was limited, just a slice of the steps and the street beyond, but it was enough to catch sight of the elderly man walking slowly away from the entrance, his shoulders set against disappointment, his pace that of someone who had come a long way for nothing. Something about his silhouette struck her as familiar. Not immediately recognizable, but familiar in the way that childhood songs or half-remembered dreams can suddenly surface from decades of buried memory. She found herself leaning toward the window, trying to get a better look, trying to understand why this stranger's departure was causing such an unexpected emotional response. And then he turned slightly, adjusting the collar of his peacoat against the November wind, and Margaret Harrison saw his profile clearly for the first time in 30 years. The sound that escaped her throat was part gasp, part sob, part exclamation of recognition that had been building for 3 decades. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widened, and suddenly she was rising from the pew despite the approaching start of the ceremony, despite the hundreds of eyes that would follow her movement, despite every rule of protocol and propriety that governed military funerals. "Willie," she whispered, then louder, "Willie." Her daughter reached for her arm, confused by this sudden disruption. "Mom, what's wrong? The service is about to start." But Margaret was already moving, pushing past family members, ignoring the surprised looks of generals and dignitaries, focused entirely on reaching the cathedral doors before the man outside disappeared forever. She moved with surprising speed for a woman of 78, driven by an urgency that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the sudden recognition that the most important guest at her husband's funeral was walking away because nobody had thought to include him. The cathedral doors were heavy, designed more for permanence than convenience, but Margaret threw them open with strength born of desperation. The November air hit her face like a slap, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were scanning the steps, the sidewalk, the street beyond, searching for the figure in the navy peacoat who represented a piece of her husband's history that she had thought was lost forever. "Willie," she called again, her voice carrying across the space between the cathedral and the street with the power of 3 decades of searching. William Torres stopped walking. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Then, slowly, he turned around, his eyes finding the woman in black standing at the top of the cathedral steps, her face streaked with tears, her hand extended toward him as if she could pull him back through sheer force of will. The recognition was mutual and immediate. 30 years collapsed into nothing. The elegant, gray-haired woman was still the young bride whose wedding he had missed because of deployment to the Mediterranean. The elderly man in the peacoat was still the young sailor who had pulled her husband from a frozen ditch in Korea and refused to leave him behind even when enemy fire made evacuation seem impossible. Margaret ran down the cathedral steps, her careful composure forgotten, her grief transformed into something that looked remarkably like joy. She reached William just as the security guards realized that something extraordinary was happening, something that went far beyond their protocols and procedures. "Willie," she sobbed, throwing her arms around the man who had saved her husband's life and shaped both their destinies. "Oh God, Willie, we've been looking for you for 30 years. William held her gently, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm the composure he had maintained throughout decades of feeling forgotten, overlooked, lost in the vast crowd of American veterans whose service had faded into historical footnote. Through his own tears, he managed to speak the words that had been waiting 3 decades to be said. "I'm sorry I missed the wedding, Margaret. I'm sorry I missed so much." The security guards watched this reunion with growing understanding that they had almost made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just any veteran hoping to pay respects. This was family in the truest sense, bound not by blood but by shared sacrifice, mutual loyalty, and love that had survived separation, silence, and the simple cruelty of time. Sergeant Major Kim approached carefully, his clipboard suddenly feeling irrelevant. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Margaret looked up, her face radiant despite her tears. "This is William Torres," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a military wife accustomed to making introductions that mattered. "He saved my husband's life in Korea. More than that, he was the one who encouraged Robert to propose to me. He was supposed to be my husband's best man, but he was deployed overseas when we got married." She turned back to William, her hands gripping his arms as if she was afraid he might disappear again. "We tried to find you, Willie. For 30 years, we tried. Robert hired private investigators. We contacted the Navy, the Veterans Administration, everyone we could think of. Where have you been?" William's smile was gentle, understanding. "I've been right here, Margaret. Working, living, getting by. I tried to find you and Robert too, but you kept getting promoted, kept moving, and I guess I fell through the cracks somewhere along the way." The guards stepped aside without being asked, their professional instincts telling them that protocol had been superseded by something more important than security procedures. Margaret took William's arm and began leading him toward the cathedral, their pace slow enough to accommodate his careful movement but quick enough to suggest the urgency of 30 years of lost time. "You're sitting with the family," Margaret declared, her tone brooking no argument. "Front pew, where you should have been all along." "Margaret, I don't want to intrude," William began, but she cut him off with the same authority she had once used to organize officer wives' clubs and charity fundraisers. "You're not intruding. You're coming home." Inside the cathedral, the assembled mourners watched with fascination as the general's widow returned with an elderly man none of them recognized. Whispers rippled through the pews as Margaret led William down the center aisle, past generals and politicians, past family members who had never heard his name, to the front row where the most important people in Robert Harrison's life were supposed to sit. Margaret's children looked confused but didn't question their mother's decision. They had learned long ago that military life sometimes produced moments that couldn't be explained by normal social conventions, and this was clearly one of those moments. They made room in the front pew, welcoming this stranger who was obviously not a stranger to their parents, even if they had never heard his story. The chaplain, who had been waiting for Margaret's return to begin the service, approached the family section to make sure everything was ready. Margaret introduced William with the same pride she might have used to present a Medal of Honor recipient. "Chaplain Morrison, this is William Torres. He served with Robert in Korea and saved his life during the Battle of Seoul. He should be mentioned in the eulogy." The chaplain nodded, making a mental note to adjust his prepared remarks. Military funerals often revealed connections and stories that hadn't been included in the official biography, and he had learned to incorporate these revelations gracefully. As the service began, William sat beside Margaret in the front pew, still somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden transformation from excluded observer to honored guest. Around him, the cathedral filled with the sound of hymns and prayers, but his mind was focused on memories of a young lieutenant named Robert Harrison who had been more than a commanding officer. He had been a friend, a brother, a man whose life and death had shaped everything that came after. The eulogy revealed the public Robert Harrison, the decorated general, the strategic thinker, the leader who had earned the respect of subordinates and superiors alike. But when Chaplain Morrison reached the portion about Korea, he looked directly at William and spoke words that had been waiting 30 years to be said in public. General Harrison's service in Korea was marked by extraordinary courage and leadership, but those who served with him remember most clearly his loyalty to the men under his command. His life was saved during the Battle of Seoul by a young sailor named William Torres, who risked his own life to pull his wounded lieutenant from enemy fire. That act of courage created a bond that lasted long beyond their military service, and Mr. Torres is with us today to honor the man whose life he helped preserve. The congregation turned to look at William, who sat quietly in the front pew, his hands folded, his eyes focused on the flag-draped casket that held his friend. He didn't acknowledge the attention, didn't wave or nod. He simply sat with the dignity of a man who had finally found his place in a story that had always included him, even when others had forgotten. After the service, as the congregation filed out of the cathedral, people approached William with curiosity and respect. Fellow Korean War veterans shook his hand, recognizing a brotherhood that transcended rank and unit affiliation. Younger officers thanked him for his service, understanding that they were meeting a living link to the history they had studied in military academies. But the most meaningful moment came when Margaret took his arm again and led him to the waiting limousine that would carry the family to the cemetery for the burial service. "You're riding with us," she said, her tone making it clear that this wasn't a request. "Margaret, I have my own car," William began, but she cut him off with a look that reminded him why Robert Harrison had been smart enough to marry this woman. "You've been alone long enough, Willie. Today, your family." The ride to Arlington National Cemetery was quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of people who had found something they hadn't realized they were missing. Margaret held William's hand, not romantically, but with the affection of a sister-in-law who had finally been reunited with a brother she had feared was lost forever. At the graveside, William stood with the Harrison family during the final ceremonies. The honor guard performed their duties with precision, the bugler played taps with haunting beauty, and the flag was folded and presented to Margaret with the gratitude of a nation. But for William, the most important moment came when Margaret handed him one of the shell casings from the honor guard's rifle salute. "Robert would have wanted you to have this," she said simply. William accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of recognition that had been 30 years in coming. He had carried the memory of Robert Harrison through decades of civilian life, through marriage and divorce, through jobs and retirement, through the gradual acceptance that some friendships simply don't survive the chaos of post-military life. But now, standing beside Robert's grave with Margaret's hand on his shoulder and surrounded by family who had welcomed him without question, William understood that some bonds are stronger than separation, stronger than silence, stronger than time itself. After the burial, Margaret insisted that William come to the family gathering at her home. She introduced him to grandchildren who had never heard his name, but who immediately understood his importance in their grandfather's story. She showed him photo albums filled with images of Robert's military career, including pictures from Korea that William remembered being taken but had never seen developed. Most importantly, she shared stories that Robert had told her over the years about the young sailor who had saved his life and changed his perspective on courage, loyalty, and the kind of man he wanted to become. Stories that revealed how deeply Robert had been affected by William's example, how often he had spoken of the friend he had lost touch with, how much he had wanted to find him before it was too late. "He never forgot you, Willie," Margaret said as they sat in her living room surrounded by 50 years of memories. "He used to say that you taught him what real courage looked like. Not the kind that comes from training or orders, but the kind that comes from caring more about someone else's life than your own." William listened to these revelations with wonder, understanding for the first time that his impact on Robert Harrison's life had been far greater than he had ever imagined. He had thought of himself as just another sailor who had done his job, who had helped a wounded officer because that's what you do in combat. But through Margaret's stories, he began to see himself as Robert had seen him, as a man whose character had shaped not just one life but an entire career of leadership and service. As the evening wound down and other family members began to leave, Margaret walked William to his car. The parking lot was quiet now, the last of the funeral guests having departed hours earlier, but neither of them seemed in a hurry to end this day that had brought them back together after 3 decades of separation. "Don't disappear again, Willie," Margaret said, her voice carrying both a request and a gentle command. "I'm not going to lose you twice." William smiled, understanding that his years of invisibility were over. "I'm not going anywhere, Margaret. You know where to find me now." They exchanged phone numbers and addresses, making plans for regular contact that would prevent the kind of accidental separation that had cost them 30 years of friendship. Margaret made him promise to visit regularly, to become part of her extended family, to accept the place in her life that had always been waiting for him. Driving back to Philadelphia that night, William Torres carried with him more than memories of a beautiful funeral service. He carried the recognition that he had never been forgotten, never been unimportant, never been just another face in Robert Harrison's military career. He had been a friend, a brother, a man whose influence had shaped decades of leadership and service in ways he was only beginning to understand. The funeral that had almost excluded him had instead welcomed him home. The guest list that hadn't included his name had been corrected by a woman who understood that some connections transcended administrative oversight. The security that had turned him away had ultimately ushered him into a place of honor that had been waiting for him all along. Sometimes the most important people in our lives are the ones who disappear from view but never from memory. Sometimes recognition comes 30 years late but arrives exactly when it's needed most. Sometimes a funeral becomes not just an ending but a beginning, the start of connections that should never have been broken, the renewal of bonds that time had weakened but never destroyed. William Torres had come to General Robert Harrison's funeral as an uninvited stranger. He left as a cherished family member, an honored veteran, and living proof that some friendships are too important to be lost forever, no matter how many years pass or how many opportunities for connection seem to slip away. The guest list had been wrong, but love, recognition, and the bonds forged in service to something greater than ourselves had made it right. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who disappeared from your life but never from your heart? Tell us in the comments about the person you'd want to find again, the friend whose impact shaped your life in ways they might never know. And if you think stories about unbreakable bonds and second chances deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.